elections should end on election day, period. Mississippi, though, permits receipt of ballots up to 5 days after the national election day. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals held that Mississippi's law allowing some late arriving ballots to be counted is void. We are now asking the Supreme Court, find in our favor. Don't allow them to count ballots late because Congress passed the rules. Republicans and the RNC now at the Supreme Court of the United States demanding that election day means election day. You can't just keep counting votes until you get the margin of victory that you're happy with and reverse the outcome of the election. This case, of course, being battled out by Mississippi versus the RNC, and the RNC, the Republicans, have now responded in the Supreme Court of the United States. And it's being led by the chair of the RNC called Joe Gruters, and he said elections should end on election day, period. Not a complicated thing. We don't want to wait 3 or 4 days so that Fani Willis and her people can just keep counting the ballots that support their candidates. Posting this saying, the RNC now filing our response in blockbuster Supreme Court case to only count mail-in ballots received by election day. Seems pretty obvious. Saying the RNC and the chairman now released the following statement, urging the Supreme Court in a new brief to enforce federal law. It is the law. Stop Mississippi in this lawsuit from counting mail-in ballots that arrive after election day. But it's not just Mississippi. This happens in many states. We've covered it at length here for years. Saying elections should end on election day, not drag on for weeks after. When states count mail-in ballots that arrive after election day, it delays results, undermines voter confidence. The RNC has been fighting this case for nearly 2 years, and we urge the Supreme Court to affirm the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals and enforce what federal law clearly says, that only ballots received by election day should be counted. And all of these election rules really matter. We want voter ID so that one vote per person exists in our elections. We want citizenship checks so that only citizens can actually vote on an election day. We don't want ballot drop boxes so that people can go and ballot harvest. We don't want vouching like in Minnesota, where you don't even have to have an address. Somebody can vouch for you and you can vote literally on election day. The whole system is rigged. The Democrats want it to continue to be rigged. And this is just another effort in that scheme. So at the Supreme Court, the Republicans have responded in a 62-page brief. They say, look, over a century ago, Congress designated the day for the election for the House, for the Senate, and for the president. It's codified in U.S. code. This trio of statutes, 3 of them, mandates holding all elections for Congress and the presidency on a single day throughout the Union. Now, any state law that conflicts with Congress's timing decision is preempted. You can't govern differently at a state level when you're sending people to the federal government. Mississippi, though, permits receipt of ballots up to 5 days after the national election day. So they just keep coming in. And so long as mail ballots are, quote, postmarked on or before the day of the election and received by the registrar no later than 5 days, we're going to count them. So they say, no, but we put them in the mail, like the morning of the election. No. The question presented is whether the federal election day statutes preempt state laws. Supremacy clause, can the feds override the states? It's already extremely well codified in these 3 sections, 2 U.S. Code Section 1, Section 7, and 3 U.S. Code Section 1. So Supreme Court, hopefully, they give us some guidance. Most Americans remember a time when results came quickly after Election Day. Yeah, we do. Each election cycle dims that memory as states experiment with new, novel ballot handling rules. And we went to bed on election night in 2020. Trump was clearly the victor. Woke up the next morning, everything changed. One of those experiments is the prolonged receipt of mail ballots. 3, 5, 14, maybe even more days after Election Day. 14? These post-election receipt deadlines invite chaos and suspicions of impropriety that can ensue if thousands of absentee ballots flow in after the election and potentially flip the results of the election after the fact. And it's hard to blame Americans for those suspicions when some states produce quick results, while other states take days to even know how many ballots need to be counted. When news anchors remind voters, it's not over yet, they're right under any ordinary understanding. And as long as ballots are still coming in, the election isn't over, even though it's being counted days after. Now, Congress addressed this problem over a century ago. It established a uniform day for elections, exercising exercising its powers to set the time of federal elections, Congress instructed the day for the election is Tuesday next after the first Monday in November in every even-numbered year. Congress set the same rules for the presidential elections, and after the 17th Amendment came in and stripped out the Senate election provisions that were in the Constitution, made it more of a popular vote, it scheduled the regular election for that same Tuesday. Now, when Congress designated a single day, that's what it meant. It set a deadline. If a state law extends the election after that deadline, it conflicts with the feds. And since the election concludes when all ballots are received, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals held that Mississippi's law allowing some late arriving ballots to be counted is void. They explained text, precedent, and historical practice confirm this conclusion. The election day statutes govern when states must close the ballot box, not when voters must make their selections. That's why dictionaries define election as a public process that's facilitated by the state. This is an ordinary meaning, and this is why the statutes regulate the states, not the voters. That ordinary meaning was already in alignment with the court and a prior decision called Foster, since ballot receipt is the final step of the vote. Now, historical practice shows that states knew this. They understood that the ballot box had to close on election day. They did it for over a century because they were following the law. But then we got these lunatic secretaries of state. They claimed that when Congress established the day for an election, it set a deadline for voters to make their choice, right? They say that a voter casts a ballot by disposing of it in whatever manner the state says, and as long as it comes in and is sent by them, that's good enough. Now, their interpretation strictly conflicts with the text. It confuses a voter's selection of a candidate with the public election of a candidate. It's not selection, it's election. Nice. It conflicts with precedent, reducing the combined action of voters and officials, and flips the statute to support the voter. Now, Congress has the final word on the timing of federal elections, as we see. They like to forget this phrase, but the Electors Clause gives Congress exclusive power to determine the time, date, and choosing of electors for the offices of the president and the vice president. Then, another provision of the Constitution says, while states do govern time, place, and manner of holding elections, it said, and Gabe Sterling, the guy who wants to be the Secretary of State in Georgia, forgot the second half of the clause, saying Congress can't at any time by law make or alter those regulations. Oh, you're kidding, yeah. So here together, the Presidential Electors Clause and the Congressional Elections Clause are counterparts. They regulate the time of the election, a matter on which the Constitution explicitly gives Congress the final say. Now, when Congress wields its elections and its clause, it displaces state law. The states can't override it because the election day statutes preempt states' timing and the rules. Presidential electors must be appointed by a certain time, and that definition comes from a long statute that's been around forever. It was established in 1872, saying that Tuesday next after the first Monday is when the elections are actually held. Before Congress designated this National Election Day, elections were characterized by month-long voting periods. They didn't like that. In 1792, Congress required states to appoint presidential electors within 34 days preceding the first Wednesday. That statute governed presidential elections for the better part of a century, leaving the conduct of federal elections to the diversity of state arrangements. And even back then, some states did have a practice of multi-day voting. But by the 1840s, the system no longer worked. States that adopted a multi-day voting period were plagued with fraud, plagued with delay, and other issues. Yeah, because it's like the game never ends and one side can just keep putting points on the board. Both parties were screaming at each other, saying you committed fraud. Both professed to be anxious to guard against them in the future. So Congress said, we need one day, a uniform election day. Get your votes in or you're done. 1845, Congress mandated that in the presidential election years, all of this happens on a day. At the time, voting occurred contemporaneously with the receipt of the votes. The early system had elections by voice vote or show of hands that had been gradually replaced by handwritten ballots made at home and brought to the polling place on election day. And in-person voting remained a nearly universal requirement until the Civil War. For the first time, the Union saw widespread absentee voting by soldiers who were away from home. States employed two methods to ensure that the soldiers could still vote. Under the voting in the field method, election officials conducted a remote election among the soldiers in the field. Voting in the field featured all the hallmarks of a self-contained election. There were registrars maintaining voter rolls. Soldiers deposited their votes at a ballot box. Judges in the field resolved challenges, and officials tabulated the results, and they did an election and then sent their results back home. Through this method, the soldier's connection with his vote ended when he put it in the box at the time, precisely as though he was at home. Now, the second method was also known as proxy voting. That used an authorized agent who would take the soldier's ballot and cast it into the ballot box back home. The agent could deliver the ballot, and under this method, again, the ballot did not end until it was cast into the box. Now, that soldiers and not election officials would receive ballots on election day was a frequent source of objection to field voting. The problem was avoided by the appointment in the Soldiers' Voting Acts of officers or soldiers to act as constables and supervisors. So states designated the soldiers to serve as state election officials, and they were basically deputized to conduct the election. Now, after the Civil War, Congress extended the uniform election day to the House of Representatives. There were intense debates in 1871 and 1872, became even more explicit to address multi-day voting. The congressional law provided that the Tuesday after the next is the day. Then they amended the Constitution. 17th Amendment made selecting your senators by popular vote versus having the state legislatures vote them in. When war returned, so did absentee voting. During World War I, states still required election day receipt during the First World War. Number of states went back to the playbook of the Civil War, did field or proxy voting. States were experimenting with things, but these were short-lived. By 1977, only 2 states counted ballots received after Election Day. And in recent years, states have now begun to experiment with these expansive post-election receipt rules. Illinois now counts ballots that are received up to 14 days after Election Day in Illinois. What a joke. Washington doesn't even have a deadline. Yeah, just get it in here. Mail ballots are counted so long as they are postmarked no later than the day of the election. I'm like, all right, if you postmark, you have some, buddy stamping this thing. While most of these states require at least a postmark by Election Day, others will count mail-in ballots that do not bear a postmark date so long as they're received within 48 hours after the closing of the polls. See that? And we covered many lawsuits here where they just said, yeah, so what if it doesn't have a date on it? It got received by a certain time, and so it's good enough. Don't even need to have it postmarked. So after the election is over, you can just go print out a bunch of ballots, send them in, they'll count them. Many post-election receipt laws are the products of COVID, by the way. Although some states reverted to their election day deadlines after the pandemic, Mississippi didn't. They said our deadline is now in state law. Mississippi permits receipt of mail-in ballots up to 5 business days after the election, so long as the ballot is postmarked by Election Day. And so everybody's suing now. And in January, the RNC and others sued state officials. They said, you don't have the right to do that. The Republican plaintiffs claimed that the federal Election Day statutes, the federal law, preempts state law, and it's very well codified in the law. Libertarian Party also sued. Now, the district court granted in favor of Mississippi. It said, we have jurisdiction over these things. Now, the court declined to consult a history of what election means. Instead, they relied on persuasive reasoning of other district court opinions outside their jurisdiction. And we've said this before, courts are stamping all of the state election rigging rules. It continues saying, a unanimous panel, though, of the Fifth Circuit reversed on the merits. They said, no, the day for the election is the day by which ballots must both be cast by voters and received. The historical practice supports that conclusion. You can't send them in late. Now, on text, the court dismissed the secretary's argument, saying that election refers to the voter's choice, the marking of the ballot. So as long as you mark it before the election day expires, you're good, not receipt. Completely ignored that. Both parties relied on dictionary definitions, but the court found that dictionaries weren't very helpful because they didn't mention deadlines or ballot receipt. Fifth Circuit consulted another court decision in Foster. That case didn't require the court to isolate specifically what was done on an election day, but it established several principles that guided the decision. It says elections involve government actions. That is referring to the final selection of an office holder. That's what election means. You're not electing somebody when you fill out your bubble. The state is electing somebody when it counts the bubbles. So they have to take custody. Secondly, Fifth Circuit said election day requires finality. We don't want to just be putzing around for a week trying to figure out how some swing state is going to go. These sources included Mississippi regulations saying that mail-in ballots shall be final, and a Montana Supreme Court case was also referenced. And third, the Fifth Circuit also applied a holding that an election may not be consummated prior to election day. So you have to have a day. Can't be early, can't be late. Also found that history confirmed that election officials must receive these ballots by election day. And the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals found secretary's arguments were unpersuasive. Congress passed the rules because they wanted this outcome. The court also rejected the secretary's expansive reading of another case, saying that you could allow voters to mail their ballots after Election Day, proving that the act of mailing ballots equates to voting is neither logical nor necessary. So the Fifth Circuit reversed on the merits and sent this back down. And so we are now asking the Supreme Court, find in our favor. Don't allow them to count ballots late because Congress passed the rules. They set a day for election. Text of the statute, precedent, history shows this is the final day, and Mississippi is going to be collecting them for an additional 5 days after the election, which is inappropriate. Let's fast forward to see what they're ultimately asking for. They say when it enacted election statutes, Congress aimed to remove the possibility of fraud. We want to promote voter confidence. Over 150 years later, the same concerns exist. Voter fraud drives honest citizens out of the government and out of the election process. Public confidence is closely related to a state's interest in having fair elections. So election day receipt promotes integrity just as much today as it did back then when they passed this law. It helps avoid chaos, and it creates a single deadline for the receipt of the ballots. It gives us clear notice and gives everybody rules by which they can abide. So Congress advanced these policy goals when it enacted these statutes. The court need only recognize what Congress has already done. So please affirm the holding from the Fifth Circuit. Elections are one day. There's a final day for ballot receipt in federal elections. That's what Congress said, and they can't bypass that. So this court should follow what the Fifth Circuit said and affirm the decision, signed respectfully by the RNC lawyers, all listed here. And this is just one part of an election integrity effort that is part of a much bigger whole effort. Of course, they changed the rules. We saw them pervert a lot of them back in 2020, saying, well, you can just sign up online, just register online. And if you get your ballot in late, don't worry about it because we'll count it later as long as it's postmarked. Then people who don't have postmarks on their ballots challenge, and they say, well, if you don't count my ballot, you're going to be disenfranchising me as a voter. And so the judges come back and they say, well, we don't want to do that. Don't want to disenfranchise anybody because this is America, and count all of the ballots that come in late. And of course, that's obviously part of the rigging system that Democrats have created.